Hey there, folks. Welcome to today's episode of the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. My guest today is Ty Wiggins, who is the CEO and Executive Transition Practice Lead at Russell Reynolds Associates. He's calling from New York today. Ty, what's happening?
Anthony, how are you?
I'm fantastic. I'm excited. I was just telling you we got some exciting news. I won't tell you about my exciting news. We got exciting news for you. Your book is out. What a lovely time to be alive, hey?
Yeah, it's hugely exciting. I've been working on a book now for a number of years, and the publish date is tomorrow. So the book is called The New CEO. It's available tomorrow or typical bookstores, and it talks about the transition into the CEO role, but it has implications across senior executive transitions.
Awesome. I love it. And of course, by the time folks listen to this episode, it will be available now. So do check it out. I think, moving into CEO roles is one of the biggest transitions, any senior leader can make. But, as you look at the ladder of leadership, everything takes on new responsibilities, takes on new needs, new challenges, except for the one being a CEO is the loneliest. But before we get into the book, can you tell our listeners a little bit about, your practice background, the different positions that you've led that have got you up until this point?
Yeah, happy to. So, as you said, I lead the CEO and executive transition practice for Russell Reynolds. I've been with Russell Reynolds now for 5 years. Prior to that, I had my own consulting business with a business partner. And so I've been working in this area of executive coaching and development for a number of years. Before that, I ran a small franchise business, which was part of a larger organization in Australia. And I started my work life off coaching basketball straight out of university. And I did that for about 8 or 9 years, which I loved.
Cool. I did not know that. Was that in Walla Wallong or somewhere else?
It was in Sydney, and I did 6 to 7 months here in the US.
Neat. All right. Fun fact. I love asking people fun facts. So that's cool to hear. And I think that there's a lot of similarities between being an effective coach in basketball. One of the books I really like is 11 Rings by Phil Jackson. He talks about how that impacted his coaching philosophy. And then, being a CEO. So I will ask, that'll be my first question. What did you learn from coaching basketball that has supported you in being an effective CEO?
Well, one of the early lessons I had, which was really, it stayed with me since I learned it, which I started coaching women's basketball. And so I had to, at a very young age, I must have been 22, 23, I had a very high performing women's team. And I had to learn very early on that one size does not fit all when you motivate individuals. My prior experience had been pretty rudimentary in terms of, being able to motivate by, sort of getting animated and so forth. And I learned really early that that's not the case. So how I use that with the clients that I have at the moment is to remind them that as a senior leader, as CEO, you get to a point in seniority where you actually need to start to flex your style. It's not everyone just fits in with me. My view around leadership is that you need to create the environment for a variety of people to flourish. So if you don't adapt as CEO or senior leader, you miss some fantastic inputs from different styles of people that you need to have on your team.
I think that's so important. And so, as you think of the transition from not CEO to CEO, that being one lesson for you, obviously the goal of moving into a CEO is being successful as possible. And I'm kind of trying to ask, what are some of the lessons that you learned the hard way that you then really share with folks for them to be successful right away? So one of them being, making sure that you're flexing your style to adapt to others and not expecting it the other way around. Are there any other, without giving away too much of the book, are there any other key considerations you'd like our listeners to consider?
There's a number of key considerations. One is that your expectations around being CEO are often not correct. So a lot of people think that they know what it's going to be like, and then when they get into the role, they realize that it's quite different. So it's harder, and it's One of the people that I got to interview was CEO named Lisa McGowan, who's the CEO of Pets at Home, and she made a really great point around when she was stepped into the CEO role. She assumed it would be 30 to 40% harder than the divisional leader role that she'd had. After some period of time, she realized it wasn't any percent harder. It's completely different. So this is the first bit. There isn't really a training ground. Nobody is fully ready for it. So don't be surprised if you feel that way. Lots of CEOs get through that and do very, very well. So that would be the first bit. The second would be, to your point earlier, disappointingly, it is as lonely as it's made out to be. And that can be quite a shock. You know, it's you don't have the people to bounce things off in the same way. You have to be so guarded with your feelings and emotions and thought processes. And, you know, intellectually, you're at the top of the tree. So there's no one to hand things over to. So that can be quite an impact as well. And as I looked at it in the book and with the interviews that we did, you know, we sort of looked at 4 key areas. You know, when you come into an organization as CEO, you need to assess the state of the business. So you really need to understand, what is the current state? Are you in turnaround? Is it continuation? Where are you on that sort of spectrum? You need to engage the board really early and efficiently. It's one of the key regrets people have, is that they don't do that well enough. You need to set your leadership team. And I know lots of people talk about this, but it's true. It is the biggest lever, and it's the biggest regret that you hear over and over. And then you need to understand the culture, which is the positive aspects of the culture, but also the dark side.
And so I'll pick on point 3 there around your leadership team. And, you know, some CEOs inherit a leadership team and they have their kind of inner circle. Some folks have like existing folks that have been there before. I know sometimes it can create divisions because there's different expectations or collaboration. But one of the biggest things, kind of going back to, as you were saying, around the right environment, is communication. And I see that CEOs can sometimes have a very unique communication style, and that's my way of being nice. If sometimes they are a couple steps ahead, sometimes they are impatient, sometimes they are demanding because they expect a lot. And I guess it's kind of partially, how can folks lead up successfully, but then how can CEOs recognize that, you know, their communication should be pulling their leadership towards them versus, you know, motivating them with a whip, if you understand the context of my question.
I think I do. So there's probably a couple of things there. One is the pressure that the CEO feels when he or she steps into the role. So a lot of these individuals have a real bias to action. So this is them running ahead of the field, getting out in front of everyone, trying to get things done. And there's a couple of reasons. Obviously, they want to make themselves feel comfortable that they're the right person. They also want to quickly establish that they're the right person to the organization. So in some of these circumstances, you can see people doing things without proper communication. One of the things I talk about regularly is that, you know, that old saying that we judge ourselves by our intent and others judge us by our behavior. So I stress for CEOs that early on, you can win a lot of points, you know, hearts and minds around being overt about your intention. My intention is this, my intention is that. Otherwise, people are just going to take the action and put their own narrative around it. The other aspect would be, it's a significant jump when you go from senior executive to CEO in terms of, I talked about the scrutiny before, but, you know, you're generally popular, you're well known. When you become CEO, you're like the main attraction. There is nothing that you don't do that doesn't get observed and interpreted and discussed. So that can be quite impactful as well. So what you might see some CEOs do is retreat and become a little bit more aloof and restricted in their communication, almost stunted. And so that's where you can sometimes see these people that went through the process as this charismatic, personable, not quite, but almost one of us, now be this person that's very stunted and stilted in their communication. So it's one of those things that communication early on in that transition is crucial.
Yeah. And as I find it interesting, and sometimes where senior leaders and CEOs, they say, I don't want X to happen, therefore I will do Y. But in doing Y creates X. And it's just so funny that it's like counterintuitive versus kind of like leaning into it and owning it. The other thing that I find interesting, like CEO communication, is when you're an executive, you share and you're like, hey, we could do this. And then someone says, that's a good idea. The CEO says, we could do this. And then they're like, that's a should, let's go. Have you found the same thing?
Yeah, 100%. But one of the people that I got to speak to was Ron Williams, who was the former CEO of Aetna. He had this great phrase, which I used in the book, which was, a CEO's casual utterances can become concrete buildings. So if you say something, people will run off with it. There's no ideation on the fly. There's no, let's just talk about this, in a very open way. People will go and do the things that you suggest or that you thought. And so that can be a real shock for CEOs. There's a really funny story in the book about a CEO that goes into the cafeteria in the morning, casually asks what the soup of the day is. Person says it's chicken noodle soup, walks off saying, love chicken noodle soup. And then about 3 months later, one of his staff came to him and said, listen, you've got to go down and talk to the cafeteria. They've made chicken noodle soup every day for 3 months straight, and the organization is sick to death of it. So it was a nice little casual reminder of there is nothing off the cuff. There is nothing off the record. There's none of this, disregard that, well, I didn't mean this, or I was just thinking out loud when you're CEO. So you're right. It has to be, you can inadvertently be quite counterintuitive.
Yeah, which means you have to be especially impactful, but it means that your words have a lot of power. So if you are intentional about what you're doing, if you're strategic and you make sure that people trust you and like you, they don't have to necessarily like you if they trust you, but that the words make a difference. One of the things that I don't think senior leaders always consider is where the CEO is. Now, to their fairness, I guess it's not their problem where the CEO is at, but you talked about the importance of that board relationship. And one of the things that can happen is when boards start putting pressure on the CEO starts putting pressure on the team, and then it becomes a versus type environment versus a, hey, we're all on the same team. And I actually had this conversation today with somebody, and this is the stupidest example, but I tend to come up with stupid examples. So if you remember in those martial arts movies or whatever, where like one person is surrounded by a bunch of like ninjas or whatever, and then they all attack one by one, which makes absolutely no sense. Because if everybody ganged up on the person, they would always win, but because they go one by one, they don't. And I find that when CEOs need their leadership teams the most, their default behavior is to cause folks to silo versus kind of make it a collaborative effort to solve a problem. That's my perspective. Have you seen the same thing? Have you seen different things? What's your experience?
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, actually, because as a result of the pressure, we know that leadership across the board, when we fall under pressure, we default to some of our derailers or behaviors that aren't fantastic. So seeing a CEO silo the executive team is probably one of the worst cases of dealing with that pressure. I have seen on occasion CEOs create tension because the feeling was, I want them to fight for the resources. I want them to fight for the headcount. I want them to fight for the budget. That'll make us fantastic. And it does completely the opposite. So, one of the things that I think is coming up a lot, really important, is that the CEOs need to have that top team be a team, and it's often not. When we ask the question, who is your team of executive team members, they often talk about the team below them, which is the team that they're responsible for, not the team that they're accountable for. So I think as great CEOs will get that team to start thinking about that team as their first team, their first obligation. And if you can do that, you stop to have some of this silo behavior of, I come to the executive team lobbying for my group, and then rest of the time I'm on my phone while I'm listening to the other updates, and I just take it back into my area. Versus, great teams, great executive teams should be solving the enterprise problems with an enterprise mindset. That will help the CEO do a better job for the organization longer term. And I think the other aspect that you just mentioned is very true in some cases. You do see some CEOs who pit the board against the executive team. Like, they said this, so you have to do this. They won't do this, so you have to do this. And again, they create this tension, which I think is super unhelpful.
Yeah, it's not actually moving the thing forward. And then what I find it's interesting, so as a listener, like, pick up on the language when they say like our team, my team. It's like, is it the leadership team you're talking about, especially when you're meeting, or are you saying your divisions? If they're talking my team, my team, my team, we should be saying our team, our team, our team. And it's a linguistic phenomenon. And then the other thing was, if as a CEO, and I speak to you as your listening CEO, like, the intent is like ultimately people often have the same intent. So if you actually said, hey, I'm saying this because I want us to work together, I'm doing this thing because I want us to, then people will actually grab onto the intent more than the exact words. And then you can use that like more powerfully to your advantage because it's easy to misspeak. But I think if folks can get the intent, it's a lot easier to be effective. Thoughts on that side?
Yeah, agree. Which is why we were talking before, but reminding leaders, especially those that are internal, to go back to explaining the intent. You know, I've had examples where leaders have been promoted to senior roles. They've come in, they knew that a meeting wasn't very effective, so they killed the meeting straight away before they'd actually attended it. Great intent. Everyone said it was a waste of time. It wasn't serving the purpose. But because they didn't explain it, it just looked like someone who didn't care, didn't take the time to ask, and had shut down this meeting. So to your point, if you can be overt about my intention is this, then you might actually hear back, well, you know, Ty, if your intention is actually this, you're going about it the wrong way. If you really want this, this is how we do it here. And that would be a great bridge for someone coming into a new organization.
So let me ask, as we begin to wrap up here, like the idea of curiosity, because you had mentioned, new CEOs come in, they want to put their stamp on the organization, they start making a bunch of changes, and that's like the end of the spectrum. There's the other end of the spectrum where you don't want to touch anything, you leave everything alone, and nothing moves, and then people are wondering like what the heck you're doing all day. So what is your perspective on a new CEO coming in and kind of showing up like it's their first day? Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. How do you view curiosity from the lens of a CEO?
It's fundamentally important. So one of the adages I have is that you need to be curious instead of being right. And when you become a CEO or you step into a new role, remember you're coming out of a role where you're sort of you're performing at a high level. That's why you got the new one. You know how things work. You know the people. You're in this state, and all of a sudden you kind of start again. So you'll be grabbing for things that make sense. So this is where we see, a great example is when we see, say, a COO become a CEO, and the individual is the person in the organization that gets stuff done. This is what they're known for. And all of a sudden they're now CEO and they can't do it as much. So what you see them doing is jumping back into the detail and rolling their sleeves up and just, I want to feel good at the end of the day. I want to feel like I've done something. So I'm going to solve that problem. I'm going to fix that issue. And that becomes quite a challenge because you're not doing what you're now supposed to be doing. So if you can come in with a great level of curiosity and really listen and learn without your own confirmation bias running amok, it makes for a massive, massive improvement in your ability to do stuff. And where it bites you is when you find them 3 to 6 months down the track because they haven't listened, because they assumed they've started something and now they need to back it out or turn it off. And that is very damaging to your credibility.
And let alone the wake of damage that you've done within the organization because you've cut everybody's arms and legs off and then they can't do anything anymore because you were doing it. Therefore, it must be the right way. Last-ish question. Talk to me about role definition because you kind of alluded to it there, especially if you move from a COO into CEO or any other role. How do you view the importance of defining one's role up to and not limited to, like actually saying X hours here, X hours there, X hours there, so that you can be effective?
I think prioritizing, we'll sometimes talk in terms of time and energy. So as a senior leader and as a CEO, you can give your time to something, but not your energy. So where you put your energy is really, really important. And there's a lot of discussion around CEOs should do only the things that they can do. And so as part of the research for the book, we kept asking this question, like, what are the things that you found only you can do? And where we might have expected it to be strategy was actually culture. Culture came out top of every list. Lots of people are in charge of culture, but only I, as the ultimate culture carrier, can really drive that. So if you were to use, the example that you just gave in terms of how many hours a week are you spending on driving a positive culture, improving the culture, teaching people about the culture versus, getting waylaid in meetings to do financials and X, Y, Z. I think there's some real, sort of prioritization that CEOs can do. And one of the things that when I hear from boards that they're worried about their new CEO, there's usually two reasons that they're worried. And one of them, strangely enough, is that their calendar is too full. So boards will say to me, seen the CEO's calendar, she's back to back from 7 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock at night with meetings. When are they actually doing the thinking about the business that only they can do? They're the only one who's really looking 5-10 years down the track. When are they thinking about the business? And of course, as a new CEO, you're trying to impress, you're trying to get stuff done. So sitting around for an hour idly feels completely opposite to what you should be doing. So that's one of the interesting things about your point of how do you set your time up to make sure that you're doing the things that you really should be doing.
Do you agree that the only thing that the CEO can do is culture, or like the main thing that they can do that others can't?
I think the context of the answer is that whilst they can delegate a lot of things, the CEO can't be working contrary to the culture.
Understood.
Other people can be, but if they are not representative of the culture they want to drive, then the culture won't take off.
They are the end all be all as it relates to culture, but they don't necessarily need to be doing all the activities within it, but just they're the linchpin, so to speak.
Yeah. If they work against it, it has a disproportionate impact.
Yes, well said. I am confident we could talk for hours and hours and hours. Can you tell our listeners where they can listen to you for hours and hours and hours, should they choose to? And then, of course, pick up the book and just connect with you on LinkedIn or whatever.
Yeah, look, we'd love to people to connect with me on LinkedIn. The book, as I mentioned, is available from tomorrow. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the major bookstores have it. Yeah, we'd love to have people sort of reach out and engage in conversation.
Awesome. Ty, it's been a pleasure, just super fun. I wish you nothing but success with the book, with the rest of the CEOs that you support and the executive teams, and yeah, nothing but the best moving forward.
Anthony, thank you very much for having me.
Pleasure is mine. Folks, my guest today, Ty Wiggins, who is the CEO at Executive Transitions Practice Lead. That just rolls right off the tongue, but I'll get there. Thanks so much for being here. His book, The New CEO, Lessons from CEOs on How to Start Well and Perform Quickly. Any time invested on being a successful CEO is time well spent, whether that's, spending an hour doing nothing or back-to-back meetings, as long as you're making a difference. But I think that it's a recommended reading for anybody. So please check it out. Listen to this episode again. I think there's a couple gems in here. Most notably, being curious, recognizing that you have to adapt your style to the people, and then recognizing that, you are the linchpin of your team's culture and that you have a disproportionate effect on the impact of theirs. So be mindful of your choices, choose wisely. And as Uncle Ben says, with great power comes great responsibility. So use it. Ty, once again, thank you. Appreciate you. Folks, my name is Anthony Taylor. This has been the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I sure did. I got better for it. And yeah, thank you again, Ty. So appreciate you for watching. Appreciate you for listening. Appreciate you for subscribing, sharing, doing all the things. I'll see you next time.